This is the 10th presentation in history, and history is the 7th of our sequences. So there's only one complete sequence left, and that's science. I would suggest that for science, you try to get a leg up on science now. And one of the books that you should try to find is Mary Leakey's Discovering the Past. There was a new book out on the Leakey family and the origins of human beings. And there's a photograph of her in there at age 80, and she looks very fit. She's still working. She's still out there. She's a champion woman. So Mary Leakey's Discovering the Past. And along with Mary Leakey in science, we're going to pair her up with Niels Bohr. Now, Bohr is very difficult to understand. This is quantum mechanics, physics. So the book Niels Bohr's Times by Abraham Pais is in paperback, and I think that that will be a nice pairing. Right after Mary Leakey and Niels Bohr, we're going to go to Kip Thorne, his very famous popular book on black holes and time warps, and also this book on the conscious universe by Minos Kafatos. And I saw 2 copies of this at the Borders bookstore, I think the one in Westwood, so there are 2 copies already on the shelf. Somebody took my copy that I had, so I had to order this from Caltech, and it took about 2.5 weeks to get it. The final pair in science is going to be molecular biology of the cell, which is very expensive. You don't have to buy it. I will make a few pages available and go through that. But The Beat of a Different Drum, Richard Feynman, I think you would enjoy that too. So, looking ahead towards science, try to get your material ahead of time and recognize that when this education ends, it doesn't end with a whimper. It ends at full speed, because it's like warp speed, because science transforms itself into nature without any indication that it has done so. This is one of the reasons why nature is so mysterious and can only be given a zero base designate. No matter how refined your mind, no matter how pinpoint even to vanishing your yoga, nature does not disclose a beginning. Simply does not occur. That is to say, beginningness does not occur at all. And this is because nature emerges rather than begins. The Greek term for nature was physis, out of which we get physics, physis, and it doesn't mean there, it means beginning. It's just emerging. It's becoming. It's always becoming. It never is. One then would like to ask, where does it emerge from? And the best that one can say is that nature emerges from the cosmos. And you can get caught in a bind by saying, well, what is the cosmos? And as you will see in the science section, the cosmos is there because persons are real. The only way that a cosmos is real is that prior to that, somebody was real, at least one person. So that on the very deepest level, one knows that there is a divine being. There is a God. Quite objective, quite real. Who or what that divine being is completely dependent on your capacity to match your person to the scale and spectrum of God's person. The more of a person you become, the more of a person God discloses. So it's that kind of a thing. So one can say, well, before nature there was a cosmos, and before that cosmos there was a God, but where did that God come from? And one gets back into that transformation that occurred between symbols and vision. The integration cycle of reality centers itself smaller and smaller, more and more precise, until it vanishes. So that the true center of the circle of existence is a vanishing point center. Where does it vanish to? It vanishes to the other shore, as the Buddha said. Well, what is the other shore? The other shore is a differential process that begins with vision, leads to persons, leads to history, leads to the cosmos, which without a trace occurs as nature. And that cycle occurs again and again. Now one would like to say, can you not be more specific? And the answer is yes, you can be as specific as you would like. You can be as exacting as you want. This particular education is a process of infinite refinement. You can do it again and again, and each time you will refine. But as you refine, you also enlarge. Both processes happen at the same time. In this house, I've done the complete cycle now 6 times. I don't see any end in sight. The refinement that I have in my eye shows me that I can't even conceive of some kind of limitation, some kind of liminal border. And so out of just practical, pragmatic forthrightness, the best that I can say as the teacher is that you can take this process as far as you would like to take it. It will never bore you. It will always increase its capacity to understand and to scintillate. And though your understanding of such things as God, person, cosmos, such processes as history, nature, myth, as they become more refined, they will also become larger in their scope of generosity and applicability. The whole world is a stage. And any play that is written may be performed upon it. Your right as a spiritual being is that if you don't like the play that you're in, you can walk. The casting director, the agents are not gods. So one of the things that comes out of this education is an appreciation for the tremendous infinity which we all are. The ability to really understand and really appreciate what an indefinite scope of charm and delight each human being really is. It's the jewel-like capacity. But one also becomes conscious that it is your participation with them which is the jewel cutter. Other people shine better, their facets come out, if you, in a realistic way, relate with them in a number of different ways. Not just keep yourself real in one way, but engender reality vis-a-vis them and yourself in an indefinite number of ways. This way you get more and more facets, more and more the jewel-like quality of relationality comes out. This is an education. Now, at this particular juncture of the education in History 10, where we are, History 10 concerns itself with an area that we have only touched upon occasionally. We've mostly looked at the educational integration and differentiation of individuals. But this process also applies to the collective. That is to say, groups of people also go through these kinds of permutations, go through this kind of transformation, have these kinds of objective phases, these kinds of transformational mediums applied to them, so that the development of the tribe into a culture happens in the same process, the mythic process, as does the development of language. And while the development of language definitely affects the individual, for instance, the physiological arrangement of the brain is largely modified by the language structures. The Center for Japanese Language is much lower on the back lobes than the Center for English. The Center for Chinese is quite different from the Center for French. All languages do the same thing. That is to say, they integrally constellate images into larger, more synthesizing images, and those images into more comprehensive images, and those images interiorize as beginning symbols, and those symbols integrate to ever larger symbols, and finally there is an archetypal symbol that integrates them all. This process does happen. Language does this. And just as language permits the interiorization of experience engendering the mind, on the collective level, the tribe interiorizes its relationalities and values and becomes a culture. So that the mind of the individual is in many ways a parallel process to the culture of the tribe. And one has many kinds of subconscious exchanges. In the integration process, this happens all the time. In fact, the whole tendency in integration is to favor the tribe over the individual, to favor the culture over the mind. So that the mind space of individuals in the unmodified integration process becomes almost completely dominated by whatever the cultural cycle and its ethos is. So that there's such a thing as the Arab mind. There's such a thing as the Protestant mind. There's such a thing as the New Guinea mind. And one can get even more specific. There are such things as this particular tribal mind. The Tiwi in North Australia are very different in many ways from the Hopi in northern Arizona. But the style of the cultural process is the same. And so one can draw out of a comparative cultural anthropology a deeply structural approach on symbolic level to what has happened to the collective. And when one sees culture in this way, when one sees tribal relationalities interiorized to cultural ethos, And you see this in enough examples. I don't mean 2 or 3, I mean like 40, 50, 60 examples. One begins to see that there is some overwhelming pattern that asserts itself seemingly from the invisible interior of the mind and stylizes with different contents, to be sure, but nevertheless stylizes all those sets of different contents in similar way. Now, the first time that this was ever written up scientifically was only about 150 years ago. The very first book, entitled Anthropology, was by E.B. Tylor. And that was in the 1860s, I believe. So it's not that long ago. But what made a difference in the early part of the 20th century was that instead of having the kind of British Empire raconteurs who were multicultural, like E.B. Tylor or the early Sir James George Fraser, one had a scientifically disciplined group of people who were professionally trained to go out in the field and experience firsthand the content, whatever it was, with the witnessing symbolic pattern already in place previously. So that those kinds of investigators were the first to really recognize that these emotional responses, these kinship relationalities, which hold in the tribe, when they interiorize, they change their meaning and take on not a ritual aspect, but a symbolic aspect. That the difference between a tribe and a culture is that the tribe always checks with the ritual for its sense of reality, whereas a culture always checks with its symbols for its sense of objective reality. And while tribes will war with other tribes, they will only war with other tribes that are contiguous. It's only when we bump elbows that we're fine. But on the symbolic level, there's a preemptive, larger metaphorical territoriality, and cultures on symbolic level will war with any cultures whatsoever. No matter where they are, they don't have to be contiguous. So the whole world becomes a possible danger area, a peril. If that were all there were, our particular species would have died out a long time ago. We would have killed each other off a long time ago. But that's only half the story. That's only halfway through the book. The book has as many chapters after that as it does before. Because cultures can actually integrate, just like the multi-dimensional facets of interiorized experience with symbolic amplification are able to integrate further. Cultures are able to integrate, not to mix together like two decks of cards, but to integrate in an interpenetrative way. I forget the term in geology now, but when one molten matrix engulfs another, there's a kind of reciprocity that happens. And the resulting third matrix, the synthesis of the two, has distinct qualities that didn't appear in either one. And new elements come out of that exchange interpenetration. Minerals that would never have appeared suddenly appear in nature because of this process. You can't get silicates of certain metals until there is this kind of process. And without that kind of process, the whole interesting range of mineral compounds simply would not be very large. And the same thing with cultures. One gets very interesting minerals, sociological minerals, cultures that have aspects from many others, or in some cases just some others. When that happens, the integration can go further. There was a natural barrier that seemed to forbid, a liminality that was too strong to overcome. Whereas now the liminality is less, the resistance is less, and one can go further, and the integration further from these sociological mineralite cultures is that they now can become jewels. Under certain high pressure conditions, minerals become jewels. All of a sudden, it's possible to have rubies. Sociological mineralite cultures that transform and condense even further pass into civilizations. So that civilizations are anatomically distinctly different. Their structure is different. Well, that's right. A diamond is carbon, but it is a highly differentiated form of the carbon atom's possibilities. And all you have to do is just put any kind of third-rate diamond next to a piece of graphite, and you can see. And we know now, in the 1990s, that carbon can go into molecular forms that no one even believed were possible, fullerenes. You can pack carbon atoms into denser forms, larger, denser forms than diamonds. And you get kind of super transcendent forms of matter that are quite natural, quite real, but almost never occur even in the imagination of high-powered physicists. And yet, there they are. They're quite real. This quality also informs the collective forms of human beings, our species. We not only have tribal graphite and cultural minerals and civilized jewels, but there are cosmic forms of man that completely would astound the kind of human beings that usually pass for mature on the streets anywhere in the world today. There are forms of man that are dazzling. There are forms of our kind of spiritual entities that are truly unbelievably dazzling. Interstellar civilizations are beyond imagination. This kind of education leads us consistently through all of the levels and permutations that you would ever come across, and doesn't drop you off, but invites you to step off at a threshold beyond which you can go almost indefinitely. at your own pace and in your own way. And the invitation is that the time of an interstellar civilization on this planet is only about 5 or 6 generations away. Close enough to be able to already affect the dreams of little kids. Their psyches, without the veils, already picking that up. Because future jewels send such a radiance out that the whole past is illuminated. And they're already there in a future way. Already one can feel the heat. But forbidding us to get there, forbidding us to appreciate that, and beyond appreciation to creatively enjoy that, participate with that, stopping us constantly, are resistances that are almost catastrophic. And the best way to deal with those resistances is not to have anybody paint too accurate a picture of them at first until you get enough strength to be able to deal with them. Because when you have enough strength, it's like an athlete whose body is in tone can do many things that the couch potato wouldn't even begin to try. And so this education makes spiritual athletes, but in such a gradual way that you probably don't notice it from week to week or month to month. But when you look back 2 or 3 years from now, on that 2-year cycle, it will more and more keep working for you. I know when I received my Chinese degree, scroll, my mentor said, you know, you work for a PhD, but this kind of degree works for you. That's the difference. Those resistances on the individual level are scary enough, but the resistances on the tribal level, on the cultural level, are truly to be looked at with leveled firmness. In order to help us in this cycle, in order to help us string these Saturdays together and make a necklace of them, we have 2 journeys that are available each year. One has a masculine tone, the other a feminine tone. The masculine tone in the 2nd year is taking the journey of the Aeneid. The feminine tone is taking the journey of the Canterbury Pilgrims, Canterbury Tales. Chaucer has that gorgeous acceptance quality of the feminine, and Virgil has that sharp, penetrating, courageous quality of the masculine. All the readings on these journey threads are selected so that over a whole year's time one would build to kind of matching structures with all the other material that's going on. I'm going to give you one paragraph from the Aeneid from the masculine standpoint of the Aeneid for today's lecture, and then move on to today's lecture. This is book 10, and this is lines 7-13. It begins there. The scene is that Aeneas has some of his enemies that have been standing in the way of taking over the territory that will become Rome, and one of the captives, a very noble man, begs for his life, saying, in setting up your empire, one life is not going to make that much difference. I have a son, I have a father, I have all this wealth to take care of, spare me. This is how Virgil writes it. Don't forget that Virgil, with his level North Italian eyes, had seen the complete dismemberment of the Roman Republic and the patient building of the Roman Empire from occult levels on up to legions. And had seen it all. This is the pivot for the archetypal founding of Roman justice. All are now before his eyes. The tables he first came to as a stranger, the pledged right hands. He grabs 4 youths alive, 4 sons of Sulmo, then 4 raised by Ufens, to offer up as victims to the shade of Pallas, to pour out as captive blood upon the funeral pyre. Next, from far, Aeneas casts his hostile lance at Magnus. But Magnus is adroit enough to stoop, and quivering the lance flies over him. He grips Aeneas's knees, and, suppliant, he begs him, by your father's shade, and by your hopes in rising, Julius, I entreat, do spare this life for my own son and father. I have a splendid house. There, hidden deep, are many talents of carved silver. I have heaps of wrought and unwrought gold. The victory of Trojans cannot turn on me. One life will not make such a difference. So Magnus, Aeneas answering, those heaps of talents, the gold and silver that you tell of, Magnus, save them for your own sons. Such bargaining in war was set aside by Turnus, your leader, first, just when he killed Pallas. This is what Anchises, my father's shade, decides. And so says Julius, the origin of the Julian clan, Julius Caesar. And with this, he grips the Latin's helmet crest with his left hand, and his right drives on the sword hilt high into that bent beseeching neck. This Rome, the Rome that Virgil's Aeneid knit together. Why did it take something like the Aeneid to knit it together? Because it takes a written epic in ancient times to make a civilization. It took Homer to make Greek civilization. It took the Mahabharata and the Ramayana to make ancient Indian civilization. There are forms of the epic that are very interesting. The I Ching was the epic that made Chinese civilization. There are many kinds, but it always takes a written epic form to tie together all of the cultural facets and make sure that the transformation happens. The Roman Empire was made by Virgil's Aeneid. More than the legions of sword power and machine-like military tactics, a civilization must be held together by a single synthesizing vision, and the Aeneid is the vision of the Roman Empire. And as such, it has a magic power. It has a magic power because it can convey this vision to millions of people at the same time, so that they all get it in somewhat the same way. And the wheels of that civilization can hold together for good or for ill. The Roman Empire never fell. The Roman Empire was engulfed from within by this geological process of exchange. The Roman Empire, when it took over a large swath from India to Ireland, simply swallowed whole all of the indigenous symbols and peoples, and undigested it simply went in and became part of the body politic. Almost all of the religious symbols were digested, but there were two in particular that could not be digested. One was the ancient Iranian Mithraism, and the other was the ancient Middle Eastern Judaism. Neither the Jews nor Mithra could be digested by the Roman gulping down. Their digestive juices didn't make any difference at all to these symbols. So that in the 1st century AD, within 2 or 3 generations of Augustus setting up the Roman Empire, it was set up about 30 BC. Within 2 or 3 generations, one finds that all of the Roman legions' religion is no longer the Greek pantheon. It's no longer Jupiter as the Latin Zeus. It's no longer Mars as the Latin Ares. Jupiter and Mars no longer have, or even Venus, as the Latin Aphrodite. These Greek gods no longer have any kind of visionary appeal for the Roman legionnaires. Their religion now is Mithraism. Almost totally, completely. So that one finds Mithra temples everywhere, from Britain to what is now Iraq, all run and protected by the Roman legionnaires. So that military power, which is the political power structure of the empire, is in the hands of people who worship Mithra, the man slaying the bull, and many other things that are tied up with that. Whereas in the urban areas, like Rome, like Alexandria, like Ephesus, like Corinth, in those urban areas, within 2 or 3 generations, the other undigested symbol set begins to be dominant among the people. And those are Jewish symbols, but in the permutation known as Christianity. Now, the first time that the term Christian is used is in the city of Antioch, which is a pretty large city at that time, probably around 750,000 people, in what is today Syria, northern Syria. But it doesn't come into real usage until the mid-60s AD in Rome, where the persecutions under Nero, trying to single out, had learned the lesson from the persecutions of about 20 years before of Caligula, not to identify the protagonists as Jews, because that didn't turn out too well for Caligula. So they identify them as special case of Jews as Christians. And that's how the term came into usage. It had become, after the destruction of Jerusalem, it had become occultly difficult to maintain a persecution against Jews. Why? Because all of the Jewish symbols had entered into the Roman emperors. Remember with Tacitus writing about Vespasian and his two sons, Titian and Domitian? So that the Flavian emperors had Jewish symbols constellating their vision. And in the big cities, you had many common people being transformed by Christian symbols, and in the Roman legions, you had the Roman legions being transformed by Mithraic symbols. So you have three complete levels that are quite distinct, yet somehow interrelated. You have Roman emperors with Jewish vision, symbols, archetypes operating. You have Roman citizens in the urban areas with Christian symbols, and you have Roman legions out in the scattered provinces with Mithraic symbols. All three are undigested. All three have no way at all of being incorporated, mulched together into Roman civilization, because none of the three appear at all in the cultural origins of Rome. No matter what facets you have of Roman Republic culture in Italy, you do not have any Jewish, and thus no Christian, and no Mithraic symbols operating whatsoever. So it's like costume jewelry. And it's like very expensive costume jewelry. They take over you rather than you having it. As Uncle Carl said of such archetypal symbols, you don't have archetypes, they have you. And so slowly the Roman Empire permutated, just like a virus that will permutate and be a new aspect. The Roman Empire never fell, it permutated. And its aspect, when it completed its permutation, one has the beginnings of the medieval world. And in fact, the Cambridge Medieval History, Volume 1, is entitled The Christian Roman Empire. So you have a completely different civilization, not a culture. The medieval times are not the times of cultures, they're a civilization, medieval civilization. And its genesis, its overwhelming predominant quality is the Christian Roman Empire. Now, it doesn't mean that they were Christians at all. It just means that the operative symbols were that, and that the relationalities were structured in that way, and the values were calibrated in that way. When one reads something like the history of the Franks written around 550 AD, you find that nominally on the surface they're Christians and their behavior is that of farm animals, barnyard type stuff. The Cambridge medieval history begins with the Christian Roman Empire, and it comes to an apex in Volume 5 with the contest of empire and papacy. The struggle between the emperor and the pope. Because the legion's power of empire had a different operating symbol set from the emperor's operating symbol set in terms of religion. And the emperor became, in terms of religion, the pope. So that the empire emperor became different from the religious empire emperor, which is the Pope. So you have this contest, hell. It was a struggle, life and death struggle. Volume 7 of 8 is called, in the Cambridge Medieval History, Decline of the Empire and Papacy. So at the Middle Ages, the medieval civilization comes to an end. What is the title of the first volume of the Cambridge Modern History? It's called The Renaissance. The Renaissance is a completely new civilization. It's not a permutation. Not initially, not a permutation of the Roman Empire. It's not a permutation of the medieval civilization. It's a completely new civilization. And when we come back from the break, we'll have to see that this is extremely difficult to appreciate, but once having appreciated it, you'll never forget it. Because it gives a permanent insight into all kinds of stuff that for 500 years have never gone right. Let's take a break. Let's come back to what we were talking about this morning, and let's try a kind of a high Dharma way of changing the pitch and changing the tone. In Life Truths, one always tries to mitigate tragedy by comedy. But in High Dharma, one mitigates tragedy by mystery. The mysterious aspect comes into play here in History 10 because we're using Jacob Burckhardt and G.W.F. Hegel. We're using Hegel and Burckhardt as a pair. Hegel on the spirit and how the spirit, when it moves, leaves a kind of a vapor trail which is called world history. And this invisible spirit, as it moves through time, leaves this constellation of events and realities that are world history. So that in a way, world history is like a tapestry. It's like the embroidered robe of some mysterious high-level being that passes through time-space. In a way, there was a kind of a mythic image for this back in Greek civilization. In Greek civilization, the figure, the wisdom figure, whose movement makes history possible was Athena. In fact, Pallas Athena, related somehow to Virgil's Pallas, but only associatively. In a mysterious way, at the very apex of Greek civilization, in the time of Pericles, you remember we read Thucydides, or talked about Thucydides in the Peloponnesian War, and how just before that time was the age of Pericles. Pericles, in fact, initiating the whole Peloponnesian War by his vision. And while most people don't remember that Pericles initiated the Peloponnesian War, they learn when they go to Athens, named for Athena, and they go to Athens and they see in the center of the city the Acropolis, and in the center of the Acropolis the Parthenon. And the Parthenon is built by Pericles. And the Parthenon is the temple to Athena, for whom the whole city is named, for whom the whole civilization is named. And the greatest sculptor of the day, Phidias, made a 40-foot statue of Athena, made it out of wood and marble on some of the appendages, and then covered by gold gilt, an ivory face mask, And then the whole statue of Athena was clothed in a large cloak, a cape. 40-foot statue with this huge, enormous cape. It's called the peplos. And the peplos had embroidered on it all of the mythic images of the Greek Olympian religion. And one of the responsibilities in Periclean Greek civilization was that every spring the women from the best families in Athens would take that cloak off Athena and carry it all the way down 5 miles to the Piraeus and wash it in the harbor, make it fresh and clean, and then bring it all the way back up in a very ceremonial parade and redrape the goddess with her clean cloak and all the images of the gods of the Greek Olympic pantheon would shine. In a way, Hegel's understanding of the spirit moving through history is highly influenced and stylized by the archetype of the Greek civilization, reappearing in Hegel's deep subconscious, high archetypal mind, both at the same time. And though he didn't say it exactly, the image of Athena's peplos is here as the basic seed for how Hegel saw world history. Now, in his time and for 100 years afterwards, people were so bowled over by Hegel's immense intellect and stupendous erudition. They were literally steamrollered into either being Hegelians or being against him on some point. We can't argue the whole thing, but let's argue this point. And it wasn't until the experience of Nazi Germany, a Germany that just went simply hog wild with barbaric, undigested archetypal elements, simply manipulating people like puppets, that some woman, a British woman, a woman named Elizabeth Butler at Cambridge University, wrote a book through her great insight, and it's called, it's still in print, I think, it's called The Tyranny of Greece Over Germany. Yeah. So that in a way, using Hegel on the philosophy of world history, paired with Burckhardt, has all kinds of interesting possibilities that come out. For instance, we've been talking about Hegel, about the cape, the peplos of Athena, and all the images, and how the images scintillating every year must be freshened up. All this has an archetypal effect on ritual, on mythic culture, on symbolic structure, visionary capacity, on the way in which people become personal, on the way in which art happens. And I think we talked a couple of weeks ago at the very beginning of how one of the key structural ways to understand Hegel is not through his logic, but through his aesthetics. Hegel's aesthetics are far more revealing than Hegel's logic. But let's set this aside for a second. Let's keep it there on one hand, but on the other hand, let's bring Burckhardt in. Burckhardt writes about a generation after Hegel. He's very influenced by Hegel in many ways, but he's also influenced by anti-Hegel in other ways. But it's like the old truth, pro or con, if you're still influenced, you're influenced. Somebody who's a mama's boy is influenced by the mama, but somebody who's completely macho and pays no attention to motherhood at all is also still under the maternal domination. Same thing. Burckhardt is completely dominated by Hegel. But while Hegel has this immense scale and scope of all of world history, Burckhardt wants to be scientific. He wants to look at one complete form, a large form nevertheless, but small compared to the totality of world history. And so the form that he looks at is the civilization of Italy in the Renaissance. And remember, we're talking about how collective and individual are parallel processing. The individual and the tribe work in very similar ways. Very early on in his book, Burckhardt writes about how Italy was a very special kind of a place, and the only place that was somewhat near to Italy was Germany. And yet there was a remarkable difference between Italy and Germany. Nevertheless, those two were quite distinctly different from France, from Spain, from England. How were they different? And he talks about the origins of the medieval period, about how there was this contest of empire and papacy in the medieval world. And when did this contest between empire and papacy, between the emperor, who's the king of kings, and the pope, who's the vicar of the real king of kings, when does this come to a head? Burckhardt says in European history it comes to a head in the early 1200s, actually the late 1100s, the early 1200s. It's the time of St. Francis Assisi. It's also the time of Friedrich Hohenstaufen, who becomes an archetypal image in the European psychic gut, almost as strong as the archetypal image of Athena became in the Roman psychic gut. The Romans could not digest Athena very well. They gave her a Latin name, they worked her in, but Athena does not happen to be a very major figure in Roman mythology, but resurfaces in the Roman Christian Empire, just as Athena is born completely formed from the king of gods, Zeus, so the Athena figure is reabsorbed in the king of gods with the Virgin Mary in the Roman Christian Empire. And at the very peak of the medieval civilization, how do we know it's the peak of the medieval civilization? Because a very, very refined historian who followed Burckhardt, trying to be a scientific historian, looked at the medieval period just before the Renaissance to try and find, well, what was the peak of medieval civilization? If Burckhardt found the peak of Renaissance Italy civilization, what was the peak of European medieval civilization? That historian was the great-grandson of an American president. He was also the grandson of an American president, Henry Adams, whose great-grandfather was John Adams, the second president, and whose grandfather was John Quincy Adams, the sixth president, and whose father was Charles Francis Adams, Lincoln's ambassador to Britain during the Civil War. And so young Henry Adams was with his dad, part of the most famous family in America at the time, at the embassy in London during the Civil War, and he got to wondering about history. And what are these forms of history? And Burckhardt's book came out just at that time. And Henry Adams, when he found the way to look in a Burckhardian way at medieval civilization, he found that the apex of it occurred at the building of two edifices in France. One was Chartres Cathedral and the other Mont Saint-Michel. And he wrote a book called Chartres and Mont Saint-Michel. And he wrote in that wonderful historical book how civilizations have a lifespan. They are born, they live, they get aged, and they die. And he says at the very apex, one finds the twin spires of Chartres and Mont Saint-Michel. That the finest achievements of medieval civilization are there in the 1100s. And that the dedication is to the vision of Mary, the Mother of God. That in fact, the first Chartres Cathedral, just as it was being finished, burnt, and it had to be rebuilt. It had taken generations to build it. They went right back to work, and in more generations rebuilt the entire thing. And so Chartres was a testimony to the enduring cultural value of medieval civilization. Chartres was never Paris. Never had a huge population of people. But the dedication came from all over Europe to see that this get done, get made. Now the medieval period came to an end in Italy, but did not come to an exact end in France, in England, and in Spain. Burckhardt writes this: the struggle between the popes and the Hohenstaufen, Friedrich was in the Hohenstaufen family. The struggle between the popes and the Hohenstaufen left Italy in a political condition which differed essentially from that of other countries of the West. While in France, Spain, and England, the feudal system was so organized that at the close of its existence, it was naturally transformed into unified monarchies. French kings, Spanish kings, English kings. And while in Germany it helped maintain, at least outwardly, the unity of empire. Notice that in France, Italy, and Spain, one has a unified monarch. In Germany, you have somewhat a different version. You have the unity of empire. Italy helped to shake off everything entirely and became completely different. One did not have a king of Italy. One did not have a unified empire, at least outwardly in form, as in Germany. One had separate city-states, each run by a despot. Somebody in charge, somebody tough in charge, somebody calculating in charge. And while most of those were very ordinary, greedy men, occasionally there would be a talented man, and the city-state would become like a work of art. And so the whole beginning of Burckhardt's book is the state as a work of art. Now he says, Burckhardt writes, and 130 years ago, the best that they could do was his vision that all this had happened for the first time in the Renaissance. We know now that it's happened many, many times. In world history, it's happened a lot. In the Hellenistic kingdoms, in post-Pharaonic Egypt, in post-Western Zhou China, post-Sargonic Sumeria and Babylonia, many times. But Burckhardt writes, in these city-states, despots, for the first time, we detect the modern political spirit of Europe. We still recognize it because it's the same today. Surrendered freely to its own instincts, often displaying the worst features of an unbridled egotism, outraging every right and killing every germ of a healthier culture. Now, the portrait of the Renaissance despot is best made by Machiavelli, and it's called Il Principe, The Prince. And it's still in print, in many editions, and still read. Less than 200 pages, you can still read it. The Prince. And I think we've mentioned that Americans have a difficult time understanding that princes are the worst of men. We think that because Prince Charming of the Cinderella myth, that princes are nice. Whereas more ancient people who are used to court intrigues of royal families know that princes are the worst. Because they're always conniving to get higher up on the ladder. And so conniving and princes go together. Not glass slippers and princes, but conniving and princes. Yeah. The worst men are the princes, because they will use anybody and everything for their own ends. And the term that he used, unbridled egotism, it means they're not married to anybody else. They're arrogant unto themselves, especially. And so this kind of equality is there in Italy, and somewhat there in Germany, but remarkably different in France and Spain and England and wherever else someone would like to look. Italian civilization begins in the Renaissance. Before then, they're part of the medieval civilization. Modern Italy begins in the Renaissance, whereas modern Germany does not begin in the Renaissance. Modern Germany begins in the Reformation. So that when you look at the Cambridge Modern History, the first volume, volume 1, is the Renaissance. Volume 2 is the Reformation. They're quite distinctly different. When one looks at the great 3-volume History of Modern Germany by Holborn, the very first volume is the Reformation. When one seeks to understand the German language mind, you have to begin in the Reformation. You have to begin with Luther. Whereas to understand the Italian, one has to begin somewhere, and it's very difficult without Burckhardt to know just where to begin. Actually, the most powerful beginning of the Italian Renaissance is with Cosimo de' Medici. And the difference between Cosimo de' Medici and Martin Luther is astronomical. You never can mistake them. They never went on picnics together. It's true that they didn't meet. They lived somewhat separate times, but no, they wouldn't have been buddies. No. But like all great new civilizations, the Italian Renaissance civilization, starting with Cosimo de' Medici, has its forerunners, and the greatest forerunner of that was Dante. And Dante is the greatest of all of the medieval civilization poets. He's the Virgil of the medieval civilization. But rather than coming at the beginning of the civilization, like Virgil came at the very beginning of the Roman Empire civilization, Dante comes at the very end of the medieval civilization. And while Dante writes the Divine Comedy, which is the great epic that knits together the medieval civilization as best as it ever was done anywhere, he also was exiled from his native Florence. They threw him out. And the exile over on the Adriatic coast, having plenty of time to think about these things, wrote 2 little books that are the seeds out of which the Renaissance comes. They're developed in the Renaissance by Cosimo de' Medici and his family, his circle, more than any others. So that Dante is a true Colossus bestriding two different worlds. Dante sums up the medieval civilization in the Divine Comedy, but in two little tiny books. One of them read quite a bit, called The New Life. La Vita Nuova. The New Life. The new life is like a reborn person. A rebirthed person. And the rebirthed personality is one of the core occult centers of the Renaissance. Renaissance means that a whole civilization can be reborn. A renaissance. And that it isn't just a mechanical rebirth, but reborn with larger and better capacities. And so Dante's La Vita Nuova is a person, an individual, who's reborn within large capacities. And in order to go with that new life, Dante writes a second little book, which is almost never read. It's very hard to find it. I think it's only been translated twice into English, if you can imagine. It bears a title, it's a Latin title which covers up its true potential. It's called De Monarchia. But it's not about monarchy. Its true translation is On World Government. And Dante, as a new man, because he was not only the last and greatest of the medieval sages, he was the epic sage of the medieval civilization, but he himself penetrated through it into a new realm, into a Renaissance realm, into a new life, and he saw that there needs to be a different way in which men govern themselves, and that it's going to take a government which is of one whole world. On world government. And the 50 pages of Dante's De Monarchia should be bound together with Whitman's Democratic Vistas. Because you get one of the greatest, courageous human beings who's ever lived, flat out saying everything that is important and necessary as simply and as directly as possible. Because he was writing it for himself, not for some patron. Not to please anybody, but to get it out for himself. This is what is necessary. This has to happen. And one of the people influenced, mysteriously, influenced by Dante's courageousness was St. Thomas Aquinas, which Burckhardt points out that Aquinas, aside from writing his great philosophic epics, the Summa Theologica, which is like the theological epic of the whole medieval civilization, Aquinas also writes a little tiny book about world government, about the necessity of having a two-house legislature, the one house appointed by the king, the other house elected from the people, so that the people and the king come together through a bicameral legislature of two houses. And almost nobody reads Aquinas' book, little tiny book. Almost nobody reads Dante's little tiny book. But Cosimo de' Medici read those books. He got that. And in the Renaissance that we're taking a look at, there is a complete difference between the medieval civilization and the Italian Renaissance of about 1439. How do we date it at 1439? Because that was the time, the year, when Cosimo de' Medici held an ecumenical council of world religions in Florence. He had been exiled to Venice because of the jealousy of the Abruzzi family. They wanted him out. He's precocious. This young Medici kid thinks that he can run the city, and they pried him out through intrigue. And Cosimo, not somebody to be bruised, simply went to Venice and gathered around himself interesting people and saw what there was to see, and he saw all of these Byzantine scholars fleeing from Mehmed the Conqueror, who was going to devastate the city of Constantinople finally, and he saw a chance of bringing Byzantine Christianity together with Roman Christianity and maybe reinstating the original vision of who knows what God really had in mind. But let's bring people together, and they were supposed to have it in Venice, and Cosimo got it moved to Florence. And in the meantime, he had behind the scenes gotten rid of the Abruzzi family. And when he was riding back into Florence on his white horse, and he passed the empty Abruzzi estate, in typical Cosimo fashion, he simply stood up in his saddle and maintained a dignified, even keel as he rode by their empty villa and rode into Florence, and within a couple of months had this World Council of Religions there in Florence. That was the beginning of the Renaissance. Because when they started comparing notes and books and ideas, they found that there were all kinds of things that were unknown to each other. They all had bits and pieces of a puzzle, but nobody even saw that it was a puzzle before. And so in Florence in 1439, they were able to lay on the table enough pieces to see that there was a picture here that no one had seen, that the medieval civilization didn't know existed. It was subconscious at that time. And so the whole urge, practical urge, to complete the picture was to find the missing pieces, and the missing pieces were in books that no one had. And so the search went out. The Medici banking family opened up the wallets and said, "We will pay top dollar for any classical text which shows up." And of course, when you pay top dollar, you get results. You pay me top dollar, I'll change the world. Easy. That's the beginning of the Renaissance. The Italian Renaissance, because as the missing pieces were found and the picture began to clear up, it was more and more conspicuous that the visionary spiritual core of the ancient civilization was Greek and not Roman. And the Florentine people, who were not Romans, were very happy to learn that. Well, Florence is not a distant suburb of Rome. Florence is an inheritor of Athens. It's not the Renaissance of Roman Empire. A Roman Empire is a permutation that went into the medieval civilization. We have nothing to do with those guys. We have everything to do with these guys. And these guys, these Greek civilization guys, had gone very occult at the time of Alexander the Great. How occult? They went into secret Egypt. Just like the Greeks had always gone to secret Egypt. Plato had gone to Egypt. Pythagoras had gone to Egypt. In Homer, Menelaus and his whole court had gone to Egypt at the time of the Trojan War. In more ancient times, the really archaic Greeks had always gone to Egypt. But Alexander the Great went consciously to Egypt, not as someone just to be initiated, but as someone to transform everything into a new whole. This course is named the Ecumene because of that vision of Alexander the Great. A one-world mankind, that all the human beings that exist or have ever existed belong to a single, very large family. We're all related together in the sense on a cosmic level of family. We're all distant cousins in the same family. And when you have that kind of a scale of vision, planetary vision, then one can understand we need all of each other because we're all parts of a picture And if our part is missing, the picture is somewhat flawed. And while we're going to lose a few people, we can't on purpose lose people. We need as many as everybody as we can get to see what mankind looks like. Because that form has never been seen. The form of man as a whole has never been seen. Still hasn't been seen. But what the Renaissance was all about was that the Greeks in occult Egypt had learned that there was a tradition of wisdom beginning to approach that universal mankind, and that tradition was called the Hermetic tradition. The teacher for each era in that history was called Hermes Trismegistus, Tretuna in Iran. And that the best example of the method by which human beings can refine their interchanges of language and ideas to refine their ability to appreciate a teacher like the Hermes Trismegistus of the time. Because it takes a special kind of an ear to hear the Hermes Trismegistus of the time. It takes a special kind of a mind to be able to get what is being talked about, because these forms are differential, they're transcendent. They don't refer to things. They refer to meta things. One has to be able to have mind enough to see this. And so the Renaissance became especially interested under Cosimo de' Medici in retranslating all of the dialogues of Plato, because Plato was that key to understanding the Hermetic tradition. The Plato dialogues are the workbooks that train you calisthenically to get into good enough shape so that you can learn from Hermes Trismegistus. And so all the dialogues of Plato that had languished, they hadn't been translated, miraculously, because when you're paying high bucks, you get results. It was just like the Crash Manhattan Project to make the first atom bomb. The Crash project of the Renaissance was to get all of the dialogues of Plato translated into the same kind of language so that one person could teach the whole of it, and students could get the unified pattern. And Cosimo, to do things right, didn't want somebody who was tainted by other values. He took a bright young boy and had him trained in his own house to read classical Greek, to translate it into Latin, to speak Italian, and this boy was named Marsilio Ficino. And he was the son of Cosimo's doctor, personal doctor. So he took the son of his personal doctor as a young boy and had him specially trained and raised so that he could do this task. And gave him the Via Carregi, which today is owned by Lawrence Rockefeller. Gave him the beautiful yellow stucco 3-story Via Carregi up in the Tuscan hills above Florence, near Fiesole. The only thing you have to do, my boy, is translate Plato and teach it. Keep this fire alive. But because he was paying top dollar, one of the scholars fleeing from esoteric Byzantium brought with him not more dialogues of Plato, but the secret treatises of Hermes Trismegistus in the Greek that had never been translated. The medieval era never even knew about them. And Cosimo said, hold everything, finish Plato later, put all your energy and translate these Hermetic treatises for me. And Ficino, champion that time, dedicated himself, and he finished the translations in about 10 years, and on Cosmo's deathbed, he had the pleasure of hearing young, now not so young, Ficino read to him for the first time the Poimandres in a modern language edition. And he heard those beautiful, famous words. I, in a vast mind, heard a voice calling my name. This is a completely different realm. This has nothing to do with medieval permutations of Roman empires. It has everything to do with a rebirth of ancient wisdom. That's the Renaissance. And out of that, Italian Renaissance civilization becomes something completely different from anything that had gone before it for at least 1700 years. The last time the Hermetic tradition was understood with that kind of comprehension was with Plotinus. And of course, at the very end of his life, long after Cosimo had died, at the very end of his life, Ficino made sure that he translated Plotinus. And what was the year when Ficino finished translating Plotinus? 1492. Right on time for the new world. Here it is, boys. So that the Italian Renaissance between 1439 and 1492 is this colossal, torrential story of a meteoric rise in some kind of a spirit that had been forgotten and had languished for some almost 1,500 years, suddenly got its wings again. And as one of the German mystical poets, Hölderlin, says, when an angel dries its wings and springs free, the wind from it heals all the world. It's that kind of... Hölderlin was Hegel's best friend when they were in college together. So all of these qualities are coming up here in the history section right now. Now notice something interesting. Hegel lives a whole generation before Burckhardt, but Burckhardt writes about the origins of the Renaissance, which brought Greek civilization back into play in a very superconscious way, which influenced Hegel. So one has to watch out about time, chronology, and history. You have to get the chronology first, but then you have to use your vision and the symbolic structure, and you have to cut new facets. You can't leave it a linearity. It's the recutting of linearity into the pattern of scintillation that is the non-linear pattern of truth. It has nothing to do with ignoring linearity at the beginning. You have to have that linearity at the beginning. But it has everything to do with, like a jeweler, recutting the linearity into the gem. You can't cut the gem out of non-linearity, because the non-linearity in its deepest reality does not exist. Come again? The first person in 1,500 years to grind fine enough to understand that was Hegel in The Science of Logic, Chapter 1, Being, Section A, Being, Chapter 1, Being, Section B, Nothing. What does it say? It says being, pure being without any further determination. In its indeterminate immediacy, it is similar to itself alone, and also not dissimilar from any other. It has no differentiation, either within itself or relatively to anything external, nor would it remain fixed in its purity were there any determination or content which could be distinguished within it, or whereby it could be posited as distinct from some other. It is pure indeterminateness and vacuity. Nothing can be intuited in it. If there is any question here of intuition, or again, it is merely this pure and empty intuition itself. Equally, there is in it no object for thought, or again, it is just this empty thought. In fact, being, indeterminate immediacy, is nothing, neither more nor less. This has a profound effect when you come to history. Without the linear chronology to recut, you don't have anything real. Because if you take a non-linear basis and then try to recut that, all you do is work scissors around little papier-mâché doilies of fantasy. They are never real. Never. And so a preemptive aversion to linearity is first sign of psychosis vis-a-vis historical process. You have to first get the chronology down, then you recut it. It doesn't matter how brilliant you are at recutting, if you don't have that chronology first, you have nothing real to recut. There's no jewel. There's only a fiction. Well, that's what it's called. It's fictions. It's a fiction. But history is real, has real effect. Really does happen. But if you think in your mind fictions, that fantasization leaves you completely unprotected on two levels. One, you have no way to deal with real events that are actually needing attention. And two, you are wide open to all the subconscious archetypal forces that don't give a crap who you are. They're going to tell their story exactly in the way they've always told it. And you will dance their tune.